My name is Miranda Bush, and I was 26 the night I learned how fast a $12 million Manhattan penthouse can turn into a standard-issue cardboard box. We were sitting at a corner table at L Avenue at Saks. My brother Preston ordered a $400 bottle of Bordeaux before I even sat down. His wife Victoria wore a platinum Patek Philippe watch that cost more than my annual salary at the Southern District of New York. She made sure to adjust her wrist every time the waiter walked by, just so the diamond bezel would catch the overhead lighting. They were celebrating a new real estate acquisition, and I was there because my mother had begged me to make an appearance. Over the Wagyu ribeye, Victoria looked at my off-the-rack gray blazer. She let out a soft sigh of manufactured pity. She said it was a shame I settled for a dead-end government job making pennies when I had such a good brain. Preston laughed. He told the table that public service is just a polite term for people who cannot survive the real world. I put my fork down. I did not say a word. I just watched them. 2 minutes later, his phone buzzed with an alert that ended his entire life as he knew it. What happened next dismantled a corrupt real estate empire from the inside out. Welcome back to Morning Revenge. If stories about quiet people delivering cold justice hit close to home, drop your age in the comments and subscribe. That dinner stays burned into my memory like a photograph. L Avenue smells like white truffles and expensive leather. I had taken the subway from my office at the Federal Building. My shoes were practical. The hostess looked at my sensible heels for 2 seconds too long before leading me to their table overlooking the city skyline. Preston and Victoria belonged to a specific breed of New York society that measured human worth in square footage and corporate titles. Preston ran Vanguard Heights. He called himself a real estate developer. In my line of work as a senior federal bankruptcy receiver, I called his business model a highly leveraged house of cards. Victoria greeted me with a cheek kiss that smelled of heavy oud perfume and judgment. She immediately launched into a monologue about their new Hudson parcel. 300 units, 8-figure mezzanine financing. She used words like liquidity and capital yield with the breathless excitement of someone who read a financial magazine in a first-class lounge, but had never actually balanced a ledger. I did not talk much. In my job, you learn that silence is the best interrogation tactic. People hate quiet. They will fill the empty air with their own secrets if you just let them talk. So I listened, and I watched. My brother looked like a man standing on a trap door. His tailored Tom Ford suit fit a bit too loose around the shoulders, indicating recent rapid weight loss. He ordered a second glass of the Bordeaux before the appetizers arrived and swallowed it in 2 long pulls. But the most telling detail was his phone. It sat face up next to his bread plate. Every 3 minutes, the screen would light up with a silent notification. He would glance at it, his jaw tightening, his thumb twitching against his napkin. He never answered the texts. He just stared at the screen as if it were a bomb he did not know how to defuse. "You need to think bigger, Miranda," Victoria said, slicing into her endive salad. She waved her fork in the air. "Staying in a government box is just so limiting. There is no growth, no equity. You are just a glorified paper pusher for the courts." I took a sip of my sparkling water. "It is public service, Victoria. We handle asset liquidation for insolvent entities. We restructure debt. It is necessary work." Preston scoffed. He leaned back in his chair, attempting to look relaxed, but his shoulders remained stiff. "Necessary for failures," he said. "In the real world, we create wealth. We build skylines. We do not sit in dusty basements sorting through the ruins of people who could not hack it. You should let me introduce you to some of our associates, maybe get you an entry-level compliance role at a real firm, make some actual money." I looked at his hands. His knuckles were pale. The tremor in his left index finger was faint but steady. I have spent the last 4 years sitting across from hedge fund managers and corporate executives on the worst days of their lives. I know what a dying company looks like. The signs are biological before they are financial. Preston was sweating through his imported cotton shirt in a climate-controlled room. "I am fine where I am, Preston," I said, keeping my voice level. Victoria sighed again. "Well, we just worry about you. It is hard to watch you struggle when we have been so blessed." She used the word blessed the way a hunter uses a snare. It was designed to trap me into feeling small. I did not feel small. I felt a quiet, chilling clarity. The waiter approached the table presenting the black leather checkbook on a silver tray. The bill for the three of us easily cleared $1,000. Preston did not even look at the itemized receipt. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a heavy metal black card, and tossed it onto the tray. The metal hit the leather with a dull thud. "Put it on the corporate account," Preston said, waving the waiter away. "Let us consider it a charitable donation to my sister and her modest lifestyle." Victoria let out that high, sharp laugh that made the neighboring tables turn their heads. The waiter bowed his head slightly and walked away. Preston finally picked up his phone. He scrolled through his messages, his face glowing in the harsh blue light of the screen. A nerve jumped in his jaw. He typed a rapid response, deleted it, and shoved the phone back into his pocket. 2 minutes passed. Then 3. I watched the waiter walking back toward our table. His posture was rigid. He was holding the silver tray close to his chest. In high-end hospitality, a waiter returning to a table with the payment card still in hand is the equivalent of a siren going off. The waiter stopped next to Preston. He leaned in close, lowering his voice to a discreet murmur. "Sir, I apologize. The terminal is declining this card. Do you happen to have another form of payment?" The blood vanished from my brother's face. He stared at the waiter. "What did you say?" "It is coming up as declined, sir." Preston snatched the black card off the tray. His eyes darted around the restaurant, checking to see if anyone had heard. "Run it again," he hissed. "It is a routing error. Run it again." "I have run it 3 times, sir," the waiter said, his tone polite but firm. "The issuer has placed a hard hold on the account." Victoria stopped smiling. Her eyes darted from the waiter to Preston. She unclasped her designer clutch with trembling fingers, pulled out a personal gold credit card, and shoved it into the waiter's hand. "Just use this," she said, her voice tight. "It is fine. It is just a bank glitch." The waiter nodded and retreated quickly. Preston stared at the empty space on the table where his phone had been. A Tier 1 corporate black card does not experience a routing error. It does not get a hard hold over a missed payment or a technical glitch. A hard hold on that specific tier of corporate credit only happens when a federal injunction freezes the line of credit at the institutional level. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. My pulse did not elevate. My hands did not shake. I looked at the platinum watch on Victoria's wrist and then at the sweat beading on my brother's forehead. They thought I was a failure because I worked in a government basement. They did not realize that the government basement is where the foundation of their entire fake reality was currently being dismantled. The Southern District of New York operates out of a brutalist granite building on Foley Square. My office on the 12th floor has no sweeping views of the Manhattan skyline. I have 2 standard-issue Dell monitors, a heavy steel desk, and a door that locks from the inside. The air smells like recycled paper and floor wax. The HVAC system hums with a low, steady vibration that becomes the soundtrack to every case. It is a sterile environment designed for one specific purpose. We dismantle broken companies. We strip away the marketing brochures, the PR spin, and the tailored suits until nothing is left but the raw numbers. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not care about your zip code or your social status. At 8 in the morning, I broke the red tamper evidence seal on a classified referral from the Securities and Exchange Commission. The file was thick, weighing heavy in my hands. The cover page indicated a multi-agency sweep targeting systemic liquidity fraud within the luxury commercial real estate sector. I took a sip of black coffee and began reading. The mechanics of the scheme were elegant but incredibly brittle. High-end developers were securing 8-figure mezzanine loans for phantom construction projects. They were using new investor capital to pay the exorbitant interest on old debt. It was a classic shell game dressed up in imported Italian marble and designer architectural renderings. I scrolled through the digital appendix on my right monitor. The SEC had attached a preliminary target list of 30 shell corporations and holding companies suspected of commingling funds. My eyes scanned the columns of Delaware-registered entities tracing the complex webs of ownership. I reached page 4 and my index finger stopped moving on the mouse wheel. Vanguard Heights, LLC. There it was, printed in stark 12-point Times New Roman ink on federal letterhead. My brother's firm. My parents spent their entire lives treating my career like a temporary phase. They kept waiting for me to quit public service and join a private equity firm where I could make real money. They worshipped the ground Preston walked on because he leased luxury cars and bought them expensive dinners at Michelin star restaurants. They viewed my federal badge as a symbol of low ambition. They did not understand that the people I work for wield the kind of power that can vaporize a billionaire with a single signature. Looking at the SEC document, I realized my two worlds were about to collide in a spectacular wreck. My desk phone rang, breaking the quiet of the office. The caller ID displayed Preston's cell number. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. He had never called me at the office before. He despised the federal government and everything it stood for. I let it ring 3 times, letting the tension build before picking up the receiver. "Miranda," he said. His voice was entirely different from the arrogant tone he used at L Avenue the night before. The sneer was gone. In its place was a forced, oily charm, the kind of tone a desperate salesman uses right before he asks for your credit card number. "Good morning, Preston," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Listen, I am glad I caught you," he continued, his words tumbling out a bit too fast. "I know we had a tense dinner. Victoria gets a little carried away sometimes. You know how she is. But we are family, right? And family looks out for each other. Victoria and I were actually just talking about how we should include you more in the business side of things." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. I watched the cursor blink next to his company name on my screen. "What do you need, Preston?" He let out a strained chuckle. "Right to business, I like that. Look, I have a tiny favor to ask, nothing major. We are developing the Hudson parcel. Beautiful project, transformative for the neighborhood. But the city zoning board is holding up our environmental clearance. Bureaucratic red tape. They are dragging their feet and it is costing us $30,000 a day in bridge loan interest." I waited for the punchline. "You know people down there," he said, lowering his voice as if we were conspiring. "You have that federal credential. A senior receiver title carries weight. All I need you to do is make a quick phone call to the zoning commissioner. Tell them the Southern District is monitoring the Hudson parcel and needs the permits expedited for compliance reasons. Just rattle their cage a bit. Throw your weight around." He wanted me to commit a federal crime. He was asking me to impersonate a federal mandate to bypass municipal zoning laws just to save his failing profit margins. He treated my badge the same way he treated a valet ticket, a convenient tool to get what he wanted faster. He had zero comprehension of the firewall that existed between local zoning and federal asset liquidation. "Preston," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, "that is a direct violation of the Hatch Act and federal ethics protocols. I cannot use government authority to influence local commercial permitting. That is illegal." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The oily charm evaporated instantly. "Come on, Miranda. Do not give me the Boy Scout routine. Everyone does favors. I am your brother. I am handing you an opportunity to actually be useful for once, instead of pushing paper around your dreary office." "My jurisdiction is asset liquidation," I replied. "I have zero authority over city zoning, and even if I did, I would not risk my law license or my federal clearance to save you from a bad investment." The silence that followed was heavy and toxic. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. "This is exactly why you will never be anything but a bureaucratic drone, Miranda. You have no vision. You hide behind rules because you are too weak to play the real game. Do not bother coming to the family dinner on Sunday." He terminated the call. The dial tone hummed in my ear. I placed the receiver back on its cradle. He thought he was punishing me. He thought calling me a drone would shatter my confidence. He had no idea he had just handed me the missing piece of the puzzle. $30,000 a day in bridge loan interest. I turned back to my dual monitors. I minimized the SEC referral and opened the restricted federal financial tracking database. I typed Vanguard Heights into the search bar. I had avoided looking into his business for years out of a misplaced sense of professional boundaries. That boundary was now gone. The screen populated with hundreds of filings. Uniform commercial code liens, corporate tax returns, real estate deeds. I spent the next 2 hours mapping the architecture of his empire. The deeper I dug, the worse the structure appeared. The math was unforgiving. Preston did not own anything outright. Every single property in his portfolio was cross-collateralized against another. He took out a loan to buy a building, then used that building as collateral to get a second loan to pay the interest on the first. It was a staggering mountain of debt balanced on a razor wire. I pulled the specific data on the Hudson parcel he had just bragged about. The numbers were catastrophic. His debt-to-equity ratio was bordering on the absurd. He had secured mezzanine financing from a shadow lender known for charging predatory interest rates, the kind of lender who does not send polite collection letters when you miss a payment. If the zoning delay held up construction for another 2 weeks, Vanguard Heights would default on the Hudson loan. If the Hudson loan defaulted, the lender would trigger a cross-default clause, dragging down his Tribeca penthouse, his commercial leases, and every liquid asset he possessed. My brother was not a millionaire. He was a man standing in a deep hole holding a shovel. And based on the SEC referral outlining systemic liquidity fraud, he was already resorting to criminal measures to keep the dirt from caving in on him. I printed the financial summary and placed it in a red classification folder. The paperwork felt heavy in my hands. The arrogant classism Victoria paraded at the restaurant was nothing but a fragile shield. They were drowning, and because they were drowning, they were going to do something desperate. Desperate people always look for a life raft. In our family, there was only one life raft left to steal. I looked at the framed photo on my desk. It was a picture of my parents standing in front of their modest brick home in Queens. The house was fully paid off, a lifetime of quiet savings locked in concrete and brick. My stomach tightened. I knew exactly where Preston would go next to find his missing capital. My parents bought their house in Queens 30 years ago. It is a modest 2-story brick structure with a narrow driveway and a small patch of grass in the front. My father worked for the Transit Authority. My mother spent 3 decades as a middle school administrator. They never invested in the stock market. They never took luxury vacations. Every spare dollar they earned went directly into paying off their primary mortgage. That house represented their entire net worth. It was their fortress against an unpredictable world. On Sunday morning, I sat at their cramped kitchen table holding a ceramic mug of black coffee. The kitchen smelled like toasted bagels and cinnamon. It was a comforting, familiar scent that belonged to a simpler time in my life. Through the front window, I watched a pristine black Mercedes pull up to the curb. Preston and Victoria stepped out. The car was a lease, of course. Everything they touched was rented, borrowed, or leveraged. They entered the house like royalty, visiting a distant province. Victoria wore a cashmere sweater draped over her shoulders despite the mild weather. She placed a box of artisanal pastries on the counter with a grand flourish, treating the gesture like a profound act of charity. Preston wore a tailored sports coat and a crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He hugged our mother and shook our father's hand, exuding a practiced, magnetic confidence. We gathered around the dining table. The conversation started lightly, covering the weather and local neighborhood gossip, but I knew my brother. I recognized the specific glint in his eye. He was warming up a cold audience. He was pacing his delivery, waiting for the right moment to strike. It happened right after my mother poured the second round of coffee. Preston leaned forward, resting his forearms on the tablecloth. He steepled his fingers, a gesture he likely copied from a management seminar. "Dad, Mom," he began, his voice dropping an octave into a tone of serious intimacy. "Vanguard Heights is entering a new phase. We are opening up a highly exclusive friends and family funding round for the Hudson Project. I want to bring you two in on it. I want to help you build generational wealth." My father looked up from his plate, his brow furrowed. "We do not have that kind of liquid cash, Preston. You know we live on a fixed pension." Preston waved his hand, dismissing the concern instantly. "You do not need liquid cash, Dad. You are sitting on a gold mine. This house is fully paid off. It is dead equity doing nothing for you. If you take out a secondary mortgage, you could inject that capital directly into the Hudson parcel. We are projecting a 20% return year over year. You could double your retirement safety net in 18 months. The air in the room shifted. My mother glanced at my father, a mixture of apprehension and hope flickering across her face. They were elderly. They worried about healthcare costs and inflation. Preston was offering them a magic ticket. Victoria chimed in right on cue. Her timing was flawless. "Honestly, keeping your money locked in bricks and mortar is so antiquated," she said, letting out a soft, patronizing sigh. "Inflation is eating away at your purchasing power every single day. Sophisticated investors understand that equity must be put to work. You do not want to be left behind while everyone else is capitalizing on the market. It is just basic economics." She weaponized her country club vocabulary to make my parents feel small and uneducated. She made traditional savings sound like a character flaw. I set my coffee mug down. The ceramic clicked against the wooden table. I looked directly at my brother. A secondary mortgage places a lien on your primary residence, Preston, I said, keeping my pitch even and calm. If Vanguard Heights defaults, the bank forecloses on this house. They lose their home. Preston rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, exaggerated groan. Always the pessimist, Miranda. We are not going to default. The Hudson Project is prime real estate. Then let us talk numbers, I replied, leaning forward. I kept my gaze locked on his. What is your current debt-to-equity ratio on the Vanguard portfolio? His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. That is proprietary, internal information. It is a standard question for any prospective investor, I stated. Furthermore, how are you servicing your current mezzanine debt if the Municipal Zoning Board has stalled your environmental permits? You cannot break ground without those permits. If you cannot break ground, you cannot generate revenue. So where exactly is the capital coming from to cover your monthly interest payments? The kitchen went entirely silent. My father looked back and forth between us. He did not understand the intricate mechanics of mezzanine financing, but he understood the sharp, precise nature of my questions. He recognized the tone I used. It was the tone of an investigator uncovering a discrepancy. Preston's face flushed a deep, angry red. He slammed his hand flat against the table, making the silverware rattle. "Listen to her," he spat, pointing a finger in my direction. "This is exactly what I mean. This is the civil servant mindset in action. She sits in a windowless room all day looking for reasons why things will fail. She does not know how to build anything. She does not understand high-level wealth creation. She just wants to drag everyone down to her miserable standard of living." He turned back to my parents, softening his expression into a mask of wounded sincerity. "Mom, Dad, I am offering you a lifeline. I am trying to share my success with you. Do you really want to take financial advice from someone whose entire career revolves around bankruptcy?" My mother reached out and patted Preston's arm. Her eyes were sympathetic. She hated conflict. She loved her son. She saw the expensive suit and the luxury car outside, and she equated those props with financial genius. "Do not get upset, Preston," she murmured soothingly. "Your sister is just being cautious. We know you are very successful. We appreciate you wanting to include us." My father nodded slowly. "We will look at the paperwork, son. We can review the mortgage terms. It is a big decision, but we trust you." The trap clamped shut. I watched my parents voluntarily step onto the gallows Preston had built for them. A hot, burning resolve ignited in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to slam the federal referral on the table. I wanted to scream that his company was a fraudulent shell game. I wanted to tell them he was under a sealed government investigation for systemic liquidity fraud. But I could not utter a single word about it. Federal law binds my tongue. Disclosing a sealed investigation to a target is a felony. It constitutes obstruction of justice. If I warned my parents Preston would find out, he would instantly destroy evidence, shred hard drives, and route his remaining hidden assets into untraceable crypto wallets. The government would lose the case, and I would lose my law license and face prison time. I had to remain silent. I had to let them believe I was the bitter, jealous sister. I stood up from the table. I pushed my chair in carefully. I thanked my mother for the meal and walked toward the front door. I did not say goodbye to Preston or Victoria. Walking down the concrete steps of my childhood home, the afternoon air felt thick and heavy. I understood the timeline now. Preston was not just seeking capital. He was desperate to close a bridge loan to stave off his own foreclosure. He needed my parents' equity to keep the lights on for one more month. Once they signed that deed transfer, the money would vanish into his toxic debt structure, never to be seen again. I reached my car and unlocked the door. I sat in the driver's seat staring at the steering wheel. I could not warn my parents, but I could dismantle the threat before it materialized. The federal asset freeze was originally scheduled for the end of the month. That was too late. I needed to move the execution date up. I needed to lock down every single bank account, holding company, and trust associated with Vanguard Heights before Friday. I started the ignition. The engine purred a low mechanical growl. I pulled out of the neighborhood, leaving the leased Mercedes behind. My brother thought he had outsmarted me by manipulating our parents. He thought his expensive suit made him invincible. He was about to learn that federal jurisdiction does not care about tailored wool. The gears of the Southern District were already turning, and I was going to press the accelerator straight to the floor. The glow of the dual monitors illuminated my empty office on the 12th floor. Monday morning at Foley Square always smelled of stale coffee and ozone from the server rooms. I locked my door and bypassed the standard domestic financial ledgers, tapping directly into the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network database. If Vanguard Heights was bleeding capital, I needed to know exactly which artery had been slashed. The screen filled with raw banking manifests and encrypted transaction logs. I traced the origin of their last 3 mezzanine loans. The capital entered a domestic clearinghouse in Manhattan just as Preston had claimed, but the funds did not stay there to pay contractors or cover municipal zoning fees. The money vanished. I pulled the original wire transfer authorizations from the clearinghouse archives. A secure document loaded on my right monitor. I zoomed in on the signature block at the bottom of the digital page. I expected to see Preston's messy, rushed handwriting. Instead, the ink formed a tight, elegant loop with a sharp, deliberate finish. Victoria. My sister-in-law loved putting her name on things. She loved signing tabs at luxury restaurants and leaving her mark on velvet-bound guest books. Now she had left her mark on 40 counts of wire fraud. She was not a bystander in this criminal enterprise, merely spending the money her husband brought home. She was the architect of the escape hatch. My personal cell phone vibrated on the edge of my desk, interrupting the silence of the investigation. A notification flashed across the screen. It was an update from our extended family social media page. I unlocked the device and opened the application. Victoria had uploaded an album of high-resolution photos. She had hosted an exclusive bridal shower for our cousin at a boutique hotel in Soho the previous afternoon. I had not received an invitation. I scrolled through the images with a clinical detachment. The photos showed Victoria holding a crystal flute, posing intimately with my aunts and female cousins. The floral arrangements alone likely cost the equivalent of 2 months' rent for an average family. I read the caption beneath the main group photo. "So blessed to surround our beautiful bride with the people who actually matter. So glad the real family always shows up to celebrate." It was a calculated social strike. Victoria was actively building a wall between me and the rest of our bloodline. She was ensuring that if I ever tried to speak out about their financial reality, the family would view me as an alienated, jealous outcast. She wanted to isolate me so thoroughly that my voice would carry zero weight at the next holiday gathering. My mother had even commented on the photo, leaving a string of heart emojis. I locked my phone and placed it face down on the steel desk. Her social warfare meant nothing. Let her have the boutique hotels and the floral arrangements. I had her signature on a Cayman Islands wire transfer. I gathered the printouts and placed them into a heavy blue evidentiary binder. I walked down the long fluorescent hallway to the corner office belonging to Marcus Thorne. Marcus was the division chief. He had spent 20 years unraveling corporate Ponzi schemes, and he possessed the warmth of a glacier. I knocked once and pushed the heavy oak door open. I placed the open binder directly on the center of his desk. He adjusted his reading glasses and reviewed the Cayman routing numbers. I pointed to the signature blocks indicating the deliberate structuring of the transactions. Marcus did not speak for 3 minutes. He simply absorbed the data, tracing the capital flight with his index finger. Then he looked up at me. "You have built a solid cage, Bush," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "But you look like you have something else to say." I squared my shoulders. "I have an ethical disclosure, sir. The primary targets listed in this warrant application are Preston Bush and Victoria Bush. They are my older brother and my sister-in-law." Marcus leaned back in his leather chair. He did not blink. He looked down at the irrefutable evidence I had just handed him and then back up at my face. Most agents would have buried this or passed it to a colleague the second they saw a familiar name. "I am disclosing it now because the flight risk is active," I stated, maintaining direct eye contact. "If you need to reassign the receivership to another agent, I understand. But bringing a new liquidator up to speed will take 72 hours. In 72 hours, that offshore account will be emptied and the trail will go dark." Marcus tapped his pen against the mahogany desk. He knew the procedural rules governing conflicts of interest. Reassigning the case was standard protocol, but the circumstances were critical. He studied my posture, searching for any sign of hesitation or familial loyalty. "Can you execute a raid on your own blood?" he asked softly. "They are stealing from innocent investors to fund a fraudulent lifestyle," I replied, my voice unwavering, "and they are currently trying to trick my parents into mortgaging their only home to cover their tracks. My bloodline does not grant them immunity from the law." Marcus picked up his secure landline and dialed the federal magistrate on the 14th floor. "We need an emergency injunction signed in 10 minutes, Marcus told the judge. "Flight risk is imminent." An hour later, I stood in the judge's private chambers. The air conditioning was freezing against the back of my neck. The magistrate reviewed the offshore transfer logs and Victoria's elegant signature. He asked no questions. He simply signed the bottom of the asset freeze warrant with a heavy black fountain pen. The ink sealed the fate of Vanguard Heights. Marcus turned to me before we left the chambers. "I am keeping you as the lead receiver, Bush. Your brother thinks you are a low-level clerk. He will never suspect you are holding the leash. You know their schedules and their habits better than anyone in this building. Use that advantage." I walked back to my desk, holding the signed federal warrant. The trap was officially set, but the execution required precise timing. The money was scheduled to clear the Cayman accounts on the following Monday morning, which meant the drop-dead date for the federal raid was Friday. Before I could lock the final execution schedule into the agency database, my inbox chimed with a mandatory calendar invite. The Southern District was hosting a joint outreach function at a Manhattan charity gala on Wednesday night. I opened the event details and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. It was an elite real estate networking event. Vanguard Heights sponsored a table every year. Preston and Victoria would be there, soliciting new victims to feed their offshore accounts. I would have to face them in public one more time. I would have to listen to their insults and watch them flaunt their stolen wealth while carrying the sealed warrant that would end their lives. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel glistened with gold leaf and towering crystal chandeliers. The air smelled of expensive gardenias, champagne, and the distinct sharp musk of old money. It was the annual Metropolitan Real Estate Leadership Gala, an event where the city elites gathered to bid on rare wines and validate each other's net worth. The Southern District maintained a small informational booth near the entrance as part of a public outreach program on corporate compliance. I wore a plain tailored black suit that cost less than the appetizers being passed on silver trays. My federal credentials hung around my neck on a navy blue lanyard. I stood near the mahogany coat check, holding a glass of club soda with a lime wedge. I was there because Marcus required a senior presence at the compliance table, but my eyes were scanning the room for two specific people. It did not take long to find them. Victoria entered the ballroom wearing a dramatic floor-length sapphire gown with an exposed back. A diamond collar sparkled at her throat. Preston walked 3 steps behind her, looking every bit the triumphant Manhattan developer. They moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting board members and hedge fund managers with performative enthusiasm. Victoria spotted me standing by the velvet ropes. Her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before a predatory smile spread across her face. She immediately maneuvered a cluster of 3 high society women toward my position. The women were draped in mink shawls and heavy gold jewelry, looking at the venue with the bored expressions of people who owned similar properties. "Oh, look, girls," Victoria said, her voice carrying easily over the soft string quartet playing in the background. "It is my sister-in-law, Miranda. She is doing her public duty tonight." The women stopped. Victoria gestured toward my neck, highlighting the blue lanyard and the plastic federal identification card resting against my lapel. "We are so proud of her," Victoria continued, her tone saturated with malicious sympathy. "It takes a very special kind of person to accept a modest public salary. Most people in our circle could never survive without luxury, but Miranda is just so resilient. She lives in a tiny apartment in Brooklyn and works in a dreary basement for the government. Honestly, I think it is sweet how she stays content with so little." One of the mink-clad women let out a soft, condescending chuckle. "How noble," she murmured, looking at my plain suit as if it were a costume. I took a slow sip of my club soda. In the past, those words would have stung. I would have felt the burning urge to defend my career, to explain that my work protected the integrity of the financial markets. But tonight, I felt nothing. I looked at the diamond collar resting against Victoria's skin and saw a piece of physical evidence purchased with stolen investor funds. I looked at her sapphire dress and saw a future asset to be cataloged and sold at a federal liquidation auction. "I offer my service to the rule of law, Victoria," I replied, keeping my tone pleasantly detached. "It provides a level of stability that private market speculation simply cannot match. You always know where you stand at the end of the day." Victoria let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "Oh, darling, stability is just what people call it when they lack the talent to build real wealth. But keep pushing your little papers. Someone has to do the clerical work while the rest of us shape the skyline." She turned on her heel, leading her entourage into the main dining area. I watched her go, offering only a polite, ambiguous nod. She believed she was publicly humiliating me. She had no idea that every step she took across that marble floor was being tracked by the very agency listed on my plastic badge. I stepped away from the coat check and walked along the perimeter of the ballroom, staying in the dim shadows near the tall, arched windows. From this vantage point, I had an unobstructed view of the entire room. My eyes locked onto Preston. He was standing near the grand staircase, far away from his wife. He was not mingling or enjoying the champagne. He was cornered. A tall, silver-haired man in a bespoke tuxedo was pressing him against the gilded railing. I recognized the man instantly. Arthur Vance. He was a primary mezzanine investor who had put $15 million into the Hudson Parcel project. Vance was a ruthless operator who made his fortune in high-yield distress debt. He was not the kind of man you could fool with slick brochures or charm. Vance was leaning in close, his face inches from Preston's. Even from 30 feet away, I could see the dark sheen of sweat glistening on my brother's forehead. Preston's posture was defensive, his hands raised in a soothing, pleading gesture. His cheeks were flushed red, and he kept wiping his palms against his trousers. I moved closer, stepping behind a large floral arrangement to listen. The ambient noise of the party muffled their voices, but sharp fragments of their conversation drifted through the leaves. "The deadline was yesterday," Preston Vance said, his voice a razor-sharp whisper that carried a dangerous weight. "The interest payment did not clear. My accountants called the bank and the account is flagged. What is going on with the Hudson Capital?" Preston swallowed hard, his throat moving visibly. "It is just a routine administrative hold, Arthur, I swear to you. The city zoning delay caused a temporary administrative audit. The funds are completely secure. I do not care about city zoning." Vance snapped, his jaw tightening. "I want my capital returned by Friday afternoon, or I am filing a notice of default and seizing the collateral. I will strip Vanguard Heights to the bone." "Listen to me," Preston begged, stepping closer and lowering his voice even further. "Fresh capital is clearing on Monday morning. A massive private liquidity injection. It is guaranteed. $800,000 in clean equity coming directly from a private family trust. It will cover the entire interest penalty and clear the audit. Just give me until Monday." My pulse spiked. $800,000. A private family trust. He was talking about my parents' house. He had already prepared the secondary mortgage documents. He was planning to force my elderly parents to execute the equity transfer over the weekend, using their paid-off home to satisfy Vance for a few more days. He was going to throw our parents into the fire to buy himself 72 hours of air. Vance stared at Preston for a long, agonizing moment. His eyes were cold, calculating the risk. "Monday morning, Preston," he warned, tapping a heavy finger against my brother's chest. "If that wire does not hit my clearinghouse by 9 in the morning, I will send a team of corporate liquidators to your office, and I will take everything you own." Vance turned and walked away, leaving Preston standing alone by the staircase. My brother slumped against the railing, closing his eyes. He reached into his coat, pulled out a linen handkerchief, and wiped his entire face. He looked broken, exhausted, and terrified, but he was still planning to ruin our parents to save his own skin. I backed away from the floral arrangement, quietly slipping out of the grand ballroom before anyone could notice my departure. I walked past the coat check, pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Plaza Hotel, and stepped out into the crisp evening air of Fifth Avenue. The street noise of Manhattan washed over me. the honking taxis and flashing yellow lights, a stark contrast to the hollow theater inside. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my secure government phone. I bypassed the standard messaging applications and opened the encrypted agency portal. I selected Marcus Thorne's direct channel. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. Preston was desperate. He was moving on my parents' equity over the weekend. If we waited until next week, my parents would be ruined before the court could intervene. The flight risk was no longer a theoretical possibility. It was happening right now. I typed a concise message. Target is facing an immediate private default. He is actively attempting to liquidate an unauthorized family asset this weekend to satisfy a high-yield creditor. Flight risk is critical. Requesting permission to execute the federal asset freeze order and search warrants at first light on Friday morning. I pressed send. The screen flashed green, confirming receipt. 3 seconds later, my phone vibrated. A single-word response appeared from Marcus. Approved. I placed the phone back in my pocket and walked toward the subway station. The charity gala was still going on behind me. Victoria was likely still bragging about her diamond collar. Preston was likely drinking another double scotch to numb his panic. They had spent their entire lives treating me like the family failure because I chose a path built on rules instead of shortcuts. They had no idea that sunrise on Friday would bring the full, unyielding force of federal law directly to their front door. Wednesday morning arrived with a steady, freezing rain that battered the thick glass windows of the Foley Square Federal Building. I sat at my desk before the sun even crested the Manhattan skyline. The office was empty, save for the low mechanical hum of the server racks down the hall. I logged into the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network portal, navigating past the international wire logs I had secured the previous day. My focus shifted to a localized tripwire I had established within the Municipal Property Registry. Whenever a federal receiver investigates a real estate developer, standard protocol dictates placing digital flags on all associated property identification numbers. I had gone a step further. I placed a silent monitoring tag on the block and lot number corresponding to my parents' home in Queens. It was a precautionary measure born from the conversation I overheard at the charity gala. At 7:14 in the morning, the digital tripwire triggered. A bright red notification populated on my left monitor. My pulse slowed into a cold rhythmic thud. I opened the flagged municipal file. Preston had not submitted a secondary mortgage application. Arthur Vance had demanded immediate liquid capital, and a traditional mortgage underwriting process took 30 days. Preston did not have 30 days. He only had until the end of the week. To bypass the bank delays, my brother had executed a far more sinister maneuver. The document staring back at me was a quitclaim deed. I leaned closer, reading the fine print of the transfer request. The filing sought to strip the title from my parents' names and assign full ownership of the Queens property directly into a Delaware holding entity called Cobalt Apex Holdings. I ran the entity through our cross-agency database. The registered agent for Cobalt Apex was a boutique accounting firm in Tribeca, the exact firm Victoria used to manage her personal luxury asset purchases. My sister-in-law was not just a passive beneficiary of this theft, she was providing the corporate umbrella to hide the stolen house. If this deed recorded successfully, Cobalt Apex would own the property free and clear. Preston could then hand the holding company over to Arthur Vance to satisfy the Vanguard Heights debt. Vance would liquidate the asset within a month, and my parents would receive a municipal eviction notice, throwing them onto the street while Preston and Victoria sipped vintage champagne in their penthouse. My secure cell phone vibrated against the steel surface of my desk. A new voice note appeared on my personal messaging application. The sender was my mother. I clicked play, resting my forehead against my palm. The audio quality was slightly muffled, but her voice carried a bright, cheerful cadence. "Good morning, Miranda," she began, her tone light and full of relief. "I just wanted to share some wonderful news. Preston came over last night with a notary. He has been so incredibly helpful with our estate planning. He explained how complicated probate court can be, and he set up a special trust for the house to protect our assets. Your father and I just signed the final paperwork. It is such a weight off our shoulders knowing your brother is looking out for our future. He even brought us that lemon cake from the bakery we love. Anyway, I hope work is not too tedious today. Call me this weekend." The audio file ended. The silence in my office felt heavier than before. I felt a sharp, piercing ache in my chest. My mother sounded so genuinely grateful. She thought her son was securing her retirement. I pictured my father offering a firm handshake to the notary, believing he was making a smart financial decision. I pictured Preston standing in their modest kitchen, wearing his tailored suit, smiling warmly while handing them a lemon cake. He smiled at the woman who raised him, while methodically signing away the only security she possessed in this world. They possessed zero empathy. Preston and Victoria viewed our parents not as human beings, but as disposable equity. They were willing to sacrifice the safety of their own blood to maintain a fraudulent facade for a few more weeks. I could not call my mother. I could not explain that the estate planning was a lethal trap. If I alerted her, she would confront Preston. Preston would realize the federal government was monitoring his municipal filings, and he would immediately board an international flight. I had to maintain total operational security. The quitclaim deed was currently sitting in the digital queue at the Queens County Clerk office, waiting for a clerical stamp of approval to become legally binding. I had to stop the transfer, but I could not use a blunt instrument. If I filed a direct federal injunction, the county clerk would tag the deed with a Southern District freeze order. Preston would receive an automated email notifying him that the Department of Justice had intercepted his paperwork. He would instantly know the raid was coming. I needed a shadow intervention. I needed to paralyze the paperwork without leaving a federal fingerprint. I opened the Interagency Administrative Bridge. Federal receivers possess the clearance to alter municipal workflows during ongoing investigations. Instead of freezing the asset, I initiated a localized bureaucratic block. I accessed the specific deed submission and embedded a phantom compliance error into the file. I coded the error to indicate a missing signature on a supplemental lead paint disclosure form. It was a mundane, tedious administrative hurdle. I finalized the override and watched the status of the deed shift from pending to suspended. When Preston checked the municipal portal, he would not see a federal warrant. He would see a generic red rejection banner citing an incomplete municipal health disclosure. He would curse the incompetence of the local government. He would call his lawyers demanding they fix the paperwork. He would spend the next 48 hours fighting a phantom clerk in Queens, believing his survival was just one signature away. He would never suspect that his own sister had built the invisible wall standing between him and his escape route. I exhaled a slow, measured breath. The house in Queens was safe. The title remained locked in my parents' names, shielded by a deliberate clerical error. But my defensive maneuver carried a steep cost. Preston was already desperate. When he realized the equity transfer was stalled, he would panic. Arthur Vance was expecting $800,000 by the end of the week. Without the house, Preston had nothing left to offer. A predator backed into a corner always looks for a target to lash out against. Victoria was highly attuned to resistance. She operated on social dominance and control. When the financial avenues closed, she would turn to the only currency she had left: reputation. She would need a scapegoat to blame for their mounting stress, and she had already begun laying the groundwork at the charity gala. I closed the municipal portal and locked my terminal. I stood up and walked over to the narrow window looking down at the wet pavement of the city below. The rain continued to fall, washing the grime off the streets. The quiet solitude of my office offered a brief sanctuary, but I knew the storm was shifting direction. I was the only variable they did not control, and in their paranoid state, I was the easiest target for their rage. The clock was ticking down to Friday morning. The federal strike team was already securing their staging areas. I just had to survive the next 2 days of psychological warfare without giving them a single reason to look over their shoulders. Thursday morning arrived with a suffocating humidity that settled over the city. My personal phone began to vibrate at exactly 8:15. It sat on the edge of my steel desk, a small rectangular piece of glass that was about to deliver a masterclass in psychological warfare. I ignored the first 3 calls. When the notification shifted to voicemails, I finally picked up the device. The first message was from Aunt Susan. She lived in a pristine suburb in Connecticut and treated Victoria like royalty. I pressed play and held the speaker to my ear. Her voice dripped with a toxic, sugary concern. "Miranda, honey, Victoria called me this morning," she began, her tone heavy with manufactured sorrow. "We had a very long talk. We are all just so worried about you right now. Victoria told me how you acted at the charity gala and how you have been treating Preston. "Honey, it is not healthy to hold on to this much jealousy. Your brother has built a wonderful life, and you trying to sabotage his business relationships out of spite is just breaking your mother's heart. We think you need to speak to a professional. Please call Preston and apologize." I deleted the message. 5 minutes later, a second voicemail arrived. This one came from a cousin who regularly begged Preston for investment advice. His message was shorter and sharper. He told me to stop acting out and dragging the family name through the mud just because I was stuck in a low-paying government job. By noon, I had received 9 separate messages from extended relatives. The narrative was identical across the board. Victoria had spent her entire Thursday morning orchestrating a preemptive social strike. She recognized the quiet resistance I displayed at the Sunday brunch. She knew I understood the fatal flaws in their financial structure. Her countermeasure was brilliant in its cruelty. By planting the idea that I was mentally unstable and consumed by bitter envy, she effectively neutralized any warning I might try to deliver. If I went to my parents and told them the estate planning was a scam, I would sound exactly like the deranged, jealous sister Victoria had described. She was burning my reputation to the ground to protect her offshore escape route. It was a heavy, suffocating pressure. Most people would break under that kind of coordinated isolation. They would call their relatives crying, defending their character, begging to be believed. They would lash out and provide the exact emotional explosion the manipulator needed as proof of their instability. I did not call anyone back. I did not shed a single tear. I placed my phone inside my desk drawer and shut it. Let them talk. Let them share their patronizing concerns. Gossip is just a fragile construct made of breath and insecurity. I dealt in concrete reality. I turned my attention to the right monitor. The screen displayed the finalized tactical deployment grid for Friday morning. The petty noise of my relatives faded away, replaced by the cold, silent machinery of the federal government. I had a briefing at 1 o'clock with Agent Reynolds, the tactical liaison for the United States Marshal Service. He walked into my office carrying a thick, encrypted tablet. Reynolds was a man devoid of humor or pretense. He wore a dark suit that failed to hide the tactical vest beneath it. He pulled up a digital blueprint of the Tribeca penthouse. "We have 3 entry points, Receiver Bush," he stated, pointing to the schematic: the main passenger elevator, the freight elevator, and a dedicated emergency stairwell. Building management has already surrendered the override keys under the seal of the federal warrant. We will control the security cameras in the lobby and the penthouse corridor by 0800 hours. I studied the layout. "Note the location of the primary home office," I said, pointing to a room situated off the main gallery. "The target utilizes a dual encrypted server for his offshore routing. I need your cyber division to secure that hardware before he can initiate a remote wipe. Do not let him near his phone or his laptop once the breach occurs." Reynolds nodded, tapping the screen to highlight the room. "Understood. We will have a cyber tech on site. What is your preferred posture for the physical eviction?" "Standard compliance protocol," I replied, keeping my voice detached. "The property was secured with fraudulent commingled funds. It belongs to the federal government now. They will be granted 15 minutes to collect essential non-luxury items. Anything bearing a designer label remains in the custody of the court for eventual auction." Reynolds closed the tablet. "We stage a Foley Square at 0630. The strike team rolls out at 0815. We breach precisely at the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange. See you in the morning." He walked out, leaving me alone with the final asset liquidation timelines. The contrast was staggering. My family was busy diagnosing me with a mental breakdown while I was authorizing a fleet of black tactical vehicles to descend upon their golden child. Victoria thought her weaponized phone calls gave her power. She had no concept of what true power looked like. True power does not gossip. True power does not need to convince aunts and uncles of its validity. True power arrives with a federal badge and a steel battering ram. At 4 in the afternoon, my office line rang. It was a direct call from my mother. I picked up the receiver, bracing myself for the impact. "Miranda." Her voice was strained, carrying a tremor of pure exhaustion. "Please tell me what is going on. Victoria is inconsolable. She says you have been incredibly hostile. Preston is under a staggering amount of stress with his new developments, and he does not need this kind of family friction. Why are you acting this way? We are a family. You need to fix this." I closed my eyes. The urge to scream the truth clawed at my throat. I wanted to tell her that Preston was currently screaming at municipal clerks in Queens, trying to figure out why his fraudulent deed transfer was suspended. I wanted to tell her that her precious son was planning to leave her homeless. "I am sorry you were caught in the middle of this, Mom," I said, my voice low and steady. "You do not need to worry about it anymore. Everything will be resolved very soon." "Please, just call him," she begged. "Just apologize." "I love you, Mom," I said. "I will see you soon." I hung up the phone before she could say anything else. I could not listen to her plead for the man who was actively trying to destroy her. I packed up my briefcase at 6 in the evening. I walked out of the Federal Building and took the subway back to my apartment in Brooklyn. The ride was long and the train car was crowded, but I felt entirely isolated inside my own mind. My apartment was small, functional, and quiet. There was no marble. There were no crystal chandeliers, but there was also no leveraged debt, no shadow lenders waiting to collect. The walls belonged to me. I opened my closet and reached for a specific garment bag. I unzipped it and pulled out my conservative gray suit. It was tailored but unassuming. It was the uniform of a civil servant, the exact outfit Victoria loved to mock, the attire of a paper pusher. I laid the suit flat across the foot of my bed. I placed my sensible black heels on the floor beneath it. I pulled my federal badge lanyard from my purse and set it on the nightstand next to my alarm clock. I set the alarm for 5 in the morning. Victoria had spent the entire day setting the stage for my social execution. She thought she had won. She thought she had secured her position at the top of the hierarchy. She was sleeping in a $12 million penthouse, believing her luxury was a permanent condition. She did not know that the clock had already run out. I turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Tomorrow, the illusion would shatter, and the family failure would be the one holding the hammer. Thursday evening settled over Brooklyn with a damp, heavy chill. The relentless rain from Wednesday had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights. I sat in a corner booth at a small independent coffee shop 3 blocks from my apartment. The air inside smelled of roasted Arabica beans and warm cinnamon. A low jazz tune played through the overhead speakers, providing a stark contrast to the deafening anxiety radiating from my phone all day. I ordered a simple black drip coffee, holding the ceramic mug between my palms to absorb the heat. I needed a moment of profound stillness. The federal strike was less than 14 hours away. Through the fogged glass of the storefront window, I watched a sleek silver Porsche Panamera jerk to a halt by the curb. The vehicle was parked illegally, the hazard lights blinking in a frantic rhythm. The driver's side door swung open and Preston stepped onto the wet pavement. He did not look like the triumphant real estate mogul from the charity gala. The transformation was jarring. He wore the same tailored suit trousers from earlier in the day, but his expensive silk tie was missing and his collar was unbuttoned, revealing a layer of nervous sweat on his chest. He looked over his shoulder twice before pushing through the heavy glass door of the cafe. The bell chimed a cheerful note that starkly contradicted the chaotic energy he dragged into the room. He spotted me in the corner. He did not bother ordering a drink. He marched straight to my booth and slid into the leather seat across from me. He brought the scent of stale, expensive cologne and pure, unfiltered panic. I did not offer a greeting. I just looked at him. His eyes were bloodshot, mapping a frantic web of broken capillaries. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles twitched under his skin. He placed his hands flat on the wooden table, and I immediately noticed the severe tremor in his fingers. The confident predator who had mocked my civil servant lifestyle just 48 hours ago was entirely absent. In his place sat a desperate, cornered animal. "I need a favor, Miranda," he said. His voice was a hoarse, raspy whisper. He kept glancing toward the front window as if Arthur Vance or a shadow debt collector might walk past the glass. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The bitter liquid burned slightly against my tongue, keeping me grounded in the present moment. "I am off the clock, Preston," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat. He leaned forward, closing the distance between us. "I am not talking about zoning permits," he hissed his breath, smelling of bitter espresso and fear. "I am talking about survival. The municipal clerk in Queens suspended the deed transfer for Mom and Dad's house. Some phantom compliance error regarding a lead paint disclosure. It is tied up in a bureaucratic nightmare and I cannot access the equity. The bank will not let me draw a single dime." I kept my facial expression entirely blank. I offered no sympathy. I offered no surprise. I knew exactly why the deed was suspended, because I was the phantom clerk who built that bureaucratic nightmare. "I need liquid capital by tomorrow morning," Preston continued, his words spilling out in a rapid, desperate cascade. "I found a private bridge lender who can wire the funds tonight. The terms are brutal, but it will cover the immediate shortfall. The problem is, my personal credit utilization is maxed out. The lender requires a secondary guarantor to underwrite the risk." He stopped talking and stared at me. His eyes pleaded silently. "You want me to co-sign a predatory bridge loan?" I asked, stating the fact simply to let the absurdity hang in the air. "Government employees have immaculate credit ratings," he urged, tapping his trembling index finger against the table. "You have zero debt, Miranda. You have a secure federal salary. The underwriter will approve the loan instantly with your signature on the guarantee. You will not have to pay a single cent. It is just a formality to secure the wire transfer. I will buy you out of the guarantee next month when the Hudson Project generates revenue." I looked at his shaking finger, then I looked at his bloodshot eyes. He was lying. There was no revenue coming next month. If I signed that document, I would become legally responsible for his fraudulent debt. When Vanguard Heights collapsed, the shadow lender would garnish my federal wages and strip me of my law license. He was asking me to throw myself onto a live grenade to shield him from the blast. "Family helps family, Miranda," he whispered, leaning even closer. "Mom and Dad trust me. I am doing this for them. If I lose Vanguard Heights, the fallout will ruin everyone. You have to sign this." I set my ceramic mug down. The base clicked against the wooden table. "No," I said. Preston blinked, the desperate pleading in his eyes shattered, replaced instantly by a dark, venomous rage. "What did you just say?" I said, "No, Preston. I will not co-sign a bridge loan for a failing enterprise. I will not leverage my spotless financial record to subsidize your terrible investments." The air between us turned toxic. The mask of the pleading brother dissolved entirely, revealing the ruthless narcissist beneath. He sat back in the leather booth, crossing his arms. A cruel, ugly sneer twisted his features. "You really think you have the high ground here?" he spat, his voice rising in volume. "Victoria was right about you. You are a bitter, jealous little failure. You sit in your tiny apartment counting your pennies and you want everyone else to be as miserable as you are?" I let him speak. I did not interrupt. "You are entirely alone, Miranda," he continued, leaning into the cruelty. "Victoria spent the entire day talking to the family. Everyone knows you are having a mental breakdown. Aunt Susan thinks you are crazy. Our cousins think you are a toxic pariah. If you walk out of this coffee shop without signing those loan documents, I will make sure you are dead to this family." He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "I will go to Mom and Dad tonight. I will tell them you refuse to help save their retirement. I will ensure they write you out of their will. You will have nothing. No family, no inheritance, just your dreary basement office and your pathetic government badge." The threat was designed to break me. It was the ultimate emotional extortion, leveraging the smear campaign Victoria had meticulously constructed. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg for his approval or scream in defensive anger. He needed an emotional reaction to validate his power. I offered him nothing. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply picked up my coffee mug and took another slow, deliberate sip. The dark roast coated my throat. I lowered the mug and stared directly into his bloodshot eyes. I looked at the sweat forming on his brow. I looked at the severe, uncontrollable tremor in his hands. He was a hollow man projecting a fake authority he no longer possessed. "Enjoy your evening, Preston," I said. My voice was calm, carrying the serene detachment of a coroner pronouncing a time of death. His jaw dropped slightly. The total lack of fear in my eyes short-circuited his offensive strategy. He had fired his best ammunition, and it had bounced off an invisible armor. He pressed his hands onto the table, pushing himself out of the booth. "You are going to regret this for the rest of your miserable life," he snarled, grabbing his coat. He turned and stormed out of the coffee shop. The cheerful bell chimed again as the heavy glass door swung shut behind him. I sat perfectly still, watching through the fogged window. He marched to the illegally parked silver Porsche Panamera. He ripped a parking citation out from under the windshield wiper, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it onto the wet pavement. He climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door. The engine roared to life, and he sped away into the dark Brooklyn night, confident he had just intimidated his little sister into a corner. I finished my coffee in the quiet warmth of the cafe. The threats regarding the family will and the social isolation meant nothing to me. Preston was using future consequences to fight a battle that was ending tomorrow. He was threatening to cut me out of an inheritance that he had already tried to steal. I looked at the empty space on the street where his luxury vehicle had been parked. The Porsche Panamera was a highly leveraged asset, leased under the Vanguard Heights corporate umbrella. According to the tactical liquidation timeline sitting on my desk, that specific vehicle was scheduled for immediate seizure by the United States Marshal Service. Preston thought he was driving away as the victor of a psychological war. He did not know that his expensive sports car would be hoisted onto a federal flatbed tow truck in less than 14 hours. The emotional restraint I maintained in that booth was not weakness. It was total certainty. I did not need to shout or defend my character because the paperwork was already signed. The trap was locked. I paid for my black coffee, tipped the barista, and walked the 3 blocks back to my apartment, ready to initiate the final sequence. Friday morning broke with a pale gray light that washed over the Manhattan skyline. I bypassed my usual subway route and took a town car to a specific address in Tribeca. The building was a restored cast-iron fortress on a cobblestone street. The exterior was understated, but the security was impenetrable. A uniformed doorman stood at attention behind a podium of imported mahogany. He asked for my name, checking it against a leather-bound guest list. He nodded and directed me toward the private residential elevators. I stepped inside the polished brass cabin and pressed the button for the penthouse floor. Underneath my structured wool jacket, my federal identification badge rested flat against my collarbone, securely hidden from view. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a private foyer that led directly into the $12 million residence. The space was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the Hudson River. The morning fog was just beginning to burn off the water. The interior design was a masterclass in conspicuous consumption. Wide plank oak floors stretched across an open-concept living area. Abstract expressionist paintings hung on gallery white walls. Every piece of furniture looked impossibly fragile and undeniably expensive. The air vibrated with the sound of a live harpist playing in the corner and the rhythmic clinking of crystal flutes. Preston and Victoria were hosting a champagne breakfast to celebrate the closure of a new funding round. The room was populated by 24 guests. I recognized a few faces from industry publications. They were secondary-tier investors, dentists with too much liquid cash, retired software developers looking to park their capital in tangible real estate. They were the naive fresh targets Preston had scrambled to assemble to replace the looming default from Arthur Vance. Preston stood near the center of the room, bathed in natural light. He wore a flawless navy bespoke suit. He held a flute of champagne in one hand and gestured expansively with the other, telling a captivated audience about his visionary plans for the Hudson parcel. The terrified, desperate man who had begged me for a signature in a Brooklyn coffee shop just 12 hours ago was entirely buried under this polished facade. He performed the role of the infallible titan with chilling accuracy. I stepped further into the gallery. My presence was an anomaly in the sea of designer silk and tailored cashmere. I had been invited solely to serve as a prop. Victoria needed a physical representation of her own magnanimity. She needed her guests to see how charitable she was by including her struggling, unpolished sister-in-law in their glittering world. Victoria spotted me instantly. She was wearing a pristine white crepe sheath dress that hugged her frame perfectly. She excused herself from a conversation with a wealthy retired surgeon and glided across the oak floor toward me. 2 uniformed catering staff trailed slightly behind her, carrying silver trays lined with crystal glassware. "Miranda!" she called out, her voice pitched just high enough to ensure the nearest cluster of guests would hear. "I am so glad you decided to show up. We were worried you might feel a bit out of place today." I offered a brief, neutral nod. "Thank you for the invitation, Victoria." I replied, keeping my tone perfectly smooth. She turned to the nearest caterer, a young man wearing crisp white gloves. "Oh, wait," she instructed, holding up a manicured hand. "Do not give her the imported vintage. Bring out a glass of that cheaper domestic wine we keep in the back for the staff. Her palate would not know the difference anyway. We do not want to waste the good stuff on someone who drinks tap water." A few of the investors standing nearby exchanged awkward glances. One woman let out a soft, nervous chuckle, unsure if Victoria was making a joke or simply being cruel. Victoria smiled brightly, enjoying the distinct shift in power. She was reinforcing the hierarchy, making sure everyone in the room understood my position at the lowest rung of the social ladder. The caterer looked incredibly uncomfortable. He set his tray down on a side table and poured a measure of pale liquid from an unbranded bottle into a standard glass. He handed it to me, keeping his eyes focused on the floor. I accepted the glass, wrapping my fingers around the stem. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not snap back with a clever remark. I simply looked at Victoria and smiled, a genuine, calm smile. "That is perfectly fine, Victoria," I said. "I appreciate the hospitality." Her bright expression faltered for a fraction of a second. She expected me to shrink. She expected me to look humiliated or to march out of the penthouse in tears. My serene acceptance short-circuited her intended effect. She gave a curt, dismissive wave and turned back to her wealthy audience, leaving me standing alone near the entrance. I walked over to the sprawling marble kitchen island, situating myself on the perimeter of the gathering. It was the perfect vantage point. From this spot, I could observe the entire room without drawing any further attention. I took a sip of the cheap domestic wine. It tasted like vinegar and regret. I set the glass down on the marble surface and left it there. The ambient noise of the party swelled. Preston was concluding a speech about the future of Vanguard Heights, promising his new investors a return on capital that defied basic arithmetic. They nodded along, captivated by his charisma and the sheer opulence of their surroundings. They equated the $12 million penthouse with total financial security. They did not know that the artwork on the walls was cross-collateralized against a shadow loan. They did not know that the very floor they were standing on was drowning in toxic debt. I rested my hands on the cold stone edge of the island. Underneath my structured jacket, the hard plastic edge of my federal badge pressed against my collarbone. It was a grounding sensation. I casually slid my right hand into my suit pocket and gripped my encrypted government phone. I did not pull it out. I just tapped the biometric sensor on the side to unlock the screen, allowing the internal notification light to pulse through the dark fabric of my pocket. I slipped the phone out just far enough to read the secure messaging portal hidden behind the edge of my blazer. The tactical updates were rolling in with military precision. Agent Reynolds had established command. The United States Marshals were currently staging in the primary freight elevator on the ground floor. They had bypassed the main lobby to avoid triggering any early alarms from the concierge desk. A secondary team of Securities and Exchange Commission agents had already secured the perimeter of the building, locking down all pedestrian exits. I glanced up at the digital clock integrated into the sleek European oven on the wall behind me. The glowing red numbers read 9:26, 4 minutes. The countdown was strictly synchronized to the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange. The Southern District coordinated major asset freezes with the start of the trading day to prevent targets from moving liquid capital during the chaos of the morning rush. At precisely 9:30, the federal courts would transmit a digital lock to every domestic and international bank holding an account under the Vanguard Heights umbrella. 9:27. The tension in the air was palpable to me, but entirely invisible to the guests. I watched a naive investor shake Preston's hand, thanking him for the opportunity to join the inner circle. Preston beamed, clapping the older man on the shoulder. He looked so incredibly secure in his kingdom. He was riding the high of the fresh capital, believing he had successfully navigated the storm. He believed he had bought enough time to figure out a new scam to pay off Arthur Vance. 9:28. My secure phone vibrated twice. A final message from Reynolds. Breach teams are in position outside the penthouse service doors, awaiting your signal at the bell. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I smoothed the lapels of my conservative gray suit. The room was a symphony of wealth and privilege. The harpist plucked a delicate melody, the champagne flowed freely. Victoria laughed, throwing her head back, revealing her diamond collar. Preston checked his gold wristwatch, anticipating the incoming wire transfers from his new marks. They had built their entire identity on making other people feel small. They derived their self-worth from their zip code and their bank balance. In less than 60 seconds, both of those metrics would be reduced to zero, 929. I stood perfectly still, letting the final seconds tick away in my mind. The calm before the crash is always the most surreal phase of an investigation. It is the moment when the illusion is still fully intact, but the reality has already been signed, sealed, and delivered by a federal judge. The hammer was suspended in midair, directly above their heads. I did not blink. I just waited for the clock to strike. The caterers guided the guests away from the marble kitchen island and toward the formal dining area. A long custom table, crafted from a single continuous slab of reclaimed walnut, dominated the space. Gold-plated chargers rested at every seat. Hand-folded linen napkins stood tall next to imported crystal stemware. The guests took their assigned places with eager anticipation. Preston positioned himself at the head of the table, commanding the room. Victoria took the opposite end, acting as the gracious matriarch of their fabricated dynasty. I was directed to a seat near the kitchen entrance. It was the furthest possible position from the center of influence, a deliberate placement designed to keep me marginalized. I took my place without a word. The first course arrived on silver platters, the room filled with the scent of seared scallops and a bright citrus glaze. The investors murmured their approval, picking up their heavy silver utensils. Before anyone could take a bite, Preston stood up. He held his vintage champagne flute high, catching the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The ambient chatter ceased. The room fell entirely silent, waiting for the host to speak. Preston loved an audience. Even as a child, he fabricated achievements to steal the spotlight during family holidays. He always needed a crowd to validate his existence. He began his performance with a smooth, practiced cadence. He spoke about vision and the future of the Manhattan skyline. He praised the wealthy individuals seated around the table, pumping their egos and thanking them for their foresight. He talked about securing legacies and building generational wealth. Then he needed a foil. He needed a prop to highlight his own soaring success by contrasting it against someone else's perceived failure. He let his gaze sweep across the faces of his new financial victims before landing directly on me. He smiled a wide, predatory grin. He pointed his crystal flute in my direction. He told the room that true success requires stepping out of the comfort zone. He said that some people are terrified of risk, preferring to hide in the shadows, while the real players shape the world. Still stuck in that dead-end job, he sneered, letting the insult hang in the quiet air. He called my career choice embarrassing. He told the wealthy crowd that I spent my days sorting through the dreary paperwork of bankrupt strangers while they built tangible empires. Victoria leaned forward from the opposite end of the long walnut table. The diamond collar at her throat sparkled. She smirked, looking at my conservative gray suit with unfiltered disdain. "Honestly, some people just settle for less," she said. Her voice cut through the polite murmurs of the investors. She threw her head back and laughed until her eyes watered. The investors joined her. They chuckled at my expense, eager to align themselves with the perceived alpha figures in the room. They laughed at the federal employee sitting near the kitchen door. They bought into the illusion that Preston and Victoria were untouchable titans of industry. I did not react to the mockery. I did not flush with anger or avert my gaze. I chewed a small bite of my food. I swallowed. Then I lowered my hand. I set my fork down on the edge of the porcelain plate. The silver metal made a distinct, sharp click against the rim. It was a tiny sound, but in my mind it echoed like a gavel striking a block of hardwood. I checked my plain wristwatch. The second hand swept past the 12. It was precisely 9:30 in the morning. The opening bell of the market had just sounded, miles away on Wall Street. The laughter was still hovering in the air when the first digital strike occurred. Preston's smartphone rested near his water glass. It vibrated against the walnut table, emitting a harsh, urgent buzz. It was a high-priority banking alert, overriding his silent settings. The sudden noise forced a brief pause in his triumphant stance. He ignored it, preferring to bask in the admiration of his guests. But the device did not stop. It buzzed again, then a third time, rattling the crystal stemware nearby. Before he could reach for his device, a shrill ringtone pierced the dining room. It came from Victoria's designer clutch resting on her lap. She stopped laughing. Her smirk faltered as she pulled the device out and stared at the glowing screen. A shadow of profound confusion crossed her pristine features. Then the contagion spread. The phone belonging to a retired surgeon seated to my left began to chime. A second investor across the table reached into his tailored slacks as his device emitted a rapid sequence of warning tones. It became a synchronized chorus of electronic panic interrupting the lavish breakfast. The investors had authorized substantial wire transfers just hours prior, expecting the capital to clear into the Vanguard Heights escrow accounts at the start of the business day. Instead, their respective financial institutions were bombarding them with emergency fraud warnings. The federal system had intercepted the routing numbers. The money was frozen in transit, locked down by the Department of Justice. The surgeon stared at his screen, his face draining of color. He muttered a quiet oath under his breath, staring at a compliance hold notification. Preston finally picked up his phone. I remained seated at the edge of the table, keeping my posture perfectly straight. My hands rested quietly in my lap. I watched the biological reality of total ruin wash over my brother in real time. He unlocked his screen and opened the notification from his primary Tier 1 corporate bank. He expected to see an influx of fresh capital from his new marks. Instead, he encountered a digital death sentence. I knew exactly what that screen displayed because I had drafted the authorization the day before. Every single holding company trust and liquid account bearing his name had been seized by the Southern District of New York. The available balance on his sprawling empire read $0.00. The physical transformation was immediate and undeniable. The blood rapidly vanished from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His jaw went slack. The vintage champagne flute slipped a fraction of an inch in his grip before he caught it. He stared at the glowing pixels as if they were written in a foreign language. He tapped the glass, desperately refreshing the application. The numbers did not change. The federal block was absolute. He could not move a single dime to buy a cup of coffee, let alone satisfy his predatory creditors. Victoria looked up from her own screen. The manicured confidence was gone. Her offshore Cayman escape hatch had just been welded shut by international banking authorities cooperating with the federal warrant. She locked eyes with Preston across the long walnut table. The silent communication between them was a portrait of pure, unadulterated terror. The foundation of their $12 million mirage had just been vaporized. They were sitting in a penthouse they no longer owned, surrounded by people they could no longer defraud. The chuckles from the investors had died away entirely, replaced by a tense, suffocating confusion. The guests looked at their host, waiting for an explanation for the sudden chaos disrupting their meal. Preston opened his mouth, but no words came out. His vocal cords seemed paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw a full breath. I did not move a muscle. I simply sat at the marginalized edge of the table, breathing in the silent victory. The trap had sprung flawlessly. The corporate empire was dead. The agonizing tension that had built over the last week dissolved, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the law. And the physical eviction was about to begin. "There is a routing error," Preston shouted, his voice cracking as it echoed across the long walnut table. He tapped the glass screen of his smartphone so hard his knuckle turned white under the strain. "Just a localized routing error. The clearinghouse is running a routine compliance update. Nobody panic. I will call my broker and sort this out in 2 minutes." He was lying, and the people seated around him knew it. The retired surgeon pushed his heavy wooden chair back from the table. The wooden legs scraped against the wide plank oak floor, making a harsh, grating sound that cut through the delicate harp music still playing in the corner. The surgeon looked at his own phone screen and then glared directly at my brother. "Routine updates do not trigger federal fraud alerts," the surgeon said, his tone cold and clinical. "My private bank just locked my outgoing wire transfer due to a Department of Justice intercept. What kind of toxic debt are you hiding, Preston?" Before Preston could formulate a new lie, the head caterer stepped into the dining room. He wore a crisp black uniform and carried a digital payment tablet tight against his chest. He looked terrified. He bypassed the angry investors and walked straight toward Victoria at the opposite end of the table. "Mrs. Bush," the caterer said, his voice trembling slightly, "I apologize for the interruption during your breakfast, but the remaining balance for the event services just declined. The merchant issuer placed a hard hold on your primary gold card. I need a secondary form of payment to keep my staff on site." Victoria stared at the glowing tablet. The pristine white crepe sheath dress she wore suddenly looked stark and unnatural against her rapidly paling skin. The manufactured confidence she projected all morning began to dissolve. She reached into her designer clutch with shaking fingers. She pulled out a different plastic card, a premium silver line of credit, and shoved it into the caterer's hand. "Run the secondary reserve account," she ordered, her voice brittle and sharp. "It is just a bank glitch. Run it right now." The caterer swiped the silver card through the reader attached to his tablet. A bright red banner flashed across the screen, illuminating the caterer's face. "Declined!" The terminal beeped, a sharp descending tone indicating a frozen account. Victoria stopped breathing. She looked across the long table at her husband, seeking reassurance, but Preston was staring blankly at his own useless device. The $12 million penthouse suddenly felt like a sinking ship. The air grew thin. I placed my linen napkin on the table. The fabric settled quietly next to my untouched plate. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The physical movement was slow, deliberate, and devoid of hesitation. The room was spiraling into chaotic noise, but my mind remained a vault of silent focus. I reached beneath the lapel of my conservative gray suit. I grasped the plastic edges of my federal identification badge and pulled it outward, letting it rest dead center on my chest. The silver seal of the government caught the morning sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Next, I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer. I withdrew a thick manila folder sealed with bright red tamper-evident tape. I stepped away from my marginalized seat near the kitchen and walked the length of the walnut dining table. My practical heels clicked softly against the oak floorboards, marking a steady rhythm. The arguing investors parted automatically, creating a wide path for me to pass. I stopped directly in front of Preston. He looked up at me, his bloodshot eyes darting from my face to the badge resting on my jacket. I dropped the heavy folder onto the polished wood directly on top of his pristine linen placemat. The impact sounded like a gavel striking a block of hardwood. "There is no routing error, Preston," I said. My voice dropped into a sharp professional cadence. I projected my words to ensure every single person in the penthouse heard them clearly. "The Southern District of New York has just executed an emergency asset freeze on Vanguard Heights. Your corporate accounts, your personal trusts, and your offshore Cayman holdings are officially under federal custody." Preston stared at the red tape on the folder. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. A fine layer of sweat coated his forehead, catching the light. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge and was waiting to hit the pavement. "What are you talking about?" he finally stammered, a fine mist of spit flying from his lips. "You are just a clerk. You do not have the clearance to do this. You have no authority here." "I am a senior federal bankruptcy receiver," I corrected, keeping my posture rigid and my gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. "And as of 9:30 this morning, the federal court approved a comprehensive foreclosure warrant based on overwhelming evidence of systemic securities fraud. Your firm is insolvent, Preston. You have been running a fraudulent shell game, and the music just stopped playing." The phrase securities fraud acted like a physical electric shock to the room. The retired surgeon cursed loudly, grabbing his tailored wool coat from the back of his chair. The other investors followed suit, instantly abandoning their half-eaten gourmet scallops and their expensive vintage champagne. The realization hit them simultaneously. They were sitting at ground zero of a high-profile federal raid. The risk of being subpoenaed as material witnesses or getting caught in the crossfire of a criminal investigation sent them scrambling toward the foyer. They pushed past the confused catering staff, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive wreckage of my brother's empire. They did not say goodbye. They did not ask for a refund on their frozen wire transfers. They just ran. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, echoing through the long gallery, leaving the penthouse deafeningly quiet. Preston gripped the edge of the walnut table, his knuckles turning a bruised shade of purple to keep his balance. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw oxygen into his lungs. "Miranda, what have you done?" he breathed, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "We are family. You cannot do this to your own blood. You have to call this off right now. You have to tell your boss it is a mistake." "I am not standing here as your sister," I replied, my tone devoid of any familial warmth. "I am standing here as the court-appointed federal trustee. This property was purchased with commingled funds stolen from unregulated investors. It is now a seized asset belonging to the United States government. I am here to execute your immediate eviction." At the far end of the table, Victoria let out a strange, hollow gasp. The arrogant smirk she wore earlier had evaporated entirely. The color drained from her face, leaving a sickly, translucent pallor. She looked down at the gold chargers and the crystal stemware, realizing that none of it belonged to her anymore. The designer clothes in her closet, the abstract artwork on the walls, the panoramic view of the Hudson River, all of it was gone. She raised her hands to cover her mouth, and I watched her fingers shake uncontrollably. The social hierarchy she worshipped had just collapsed on top of her. She could no longer mock my civil servant lifestyle because my civil servant lifestyle had just dismantled her entire existence. The reality check had arrived, and it carried an unyielding federal stamp. I stood over my brother, watching his grand illusion shatter into a million jagged pieces, waiting for the heavy footsteps of the strike team to enter the room. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse swung open with a dull, resounding thud. 4 United States Marshals crossed the threshold, marching in perfect synchronization. They wore dark, tactical vests over navy blue uniforms, their duty belts laden with heavy equipment. 2 agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission followed closely behind, carrying empty evidentiary bins and digital logging devices. The stark, uncompromising reality of federal law enforcement clashed instantly with the abstract expressionist paintings and the reclaimed walnut dining table. The pristine sanctuary of wealth dissolved the moment heavy combat boots stepped onto the wide plank oak floors. Victoria stood frozen at the far end of the room, near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her breath caught in her throat. The diamond collar around her neck seemed to tighten, restricting her airway. She looked at the armed officers and then at the catering staff who were quietly slipping out through the service entrance, abandoning their posts. The panic bubbling inside her chest morphed rapidly into a desperate, hysterical rage. She relied on the only defense mechanism she knew how to deploy: social superiority. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings and piercing the morning air. "Get out of my home right now. You have no right to barge in here and disrupt my breakfast. Do you have any idea who we are? I am personal friends with the mayor. I sit on the charity board with the police commissioner. I will have every single one of your badges by noon, and you will all be directing traffic in the outer boroughs." I stepped forward, intercepting her line of sight. I kept my posture relaxed, but my gaze was unyielding. The marshals flanked my position, forming a solid wall of dark uniform fabric protecting the court-appointed receiver. Victoria stopped screaming. She stared at me as if I had just materialized from thin air, her brain struggling to reconcile the civil servant she mocked with the woman commanding a tactical strike team. "You do not own this home, Victoria," I said, my tone flat and clinical. "According to the forensic accounting completed by my division, this penthouse was purchased using commingled funds diverted from Vanguard Heights mezzanine investors. That makes this property the fruit of wire fraud. It is now under the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government. You are currently trespassing on seized assets." While I spoke, the Securities and Exchange Commission agents fanned out across the gallery. They did not wait for permission. One agent began photographing a rare sculpture near the foyer. Another agent pulled a sheet of adhesive barcode labels from his pocket and slapped a white sticker directly onto the base of a pristine antique vase. The casual, systematic cataloging of her prized possessions pushed Victoria further into shock. I signaled to one of the agents near the kitchen island. He handed me a folded flat piece of cardboard. I popped it open, pushing the flaps down to form a standard-issue evidence box. The brown corrugated material looked profoundly out of place against the gold-plated chargers and the crystal stemware. I walked around the edge of the dining table and placed the empty cardboard box directly in front of her on the polished wood. You and your husband have exactly 15 minutes to vacate the premises I instructed. You are permitted to pack one bag each. You may take basic toiletries, undergarments, and standard unbranded personal items. You may not take any designer clothing, high-end jewelry, electronics, or artwork. Everything bearing a luxury label remains here for cataloging and eventual auction to repay your defrauded investors. Your time starts right now. Victoria looked at the brown cardboard. Her knees buckled slightly, causing the white crepe sheath dress to drape awkwardly around her legs. She reached out and gripped the back of a dining chair to keep herself upright. She glanced longingly at a Birkin handbag resting on a side table. The lead marshal followed her gaze and slowly shook his head side to side. The realization that she was leaving a $12 million residence with nothing but a cardboard box stripped away the last remaining shreds of her fabricated dignity. Preston watched his wife crumble under the weight of the law. The sight triggered a sudden, irrational surge of bravado in him. He could not accept the total loss of control in his own supposed kingdom. He pushed away from the head of the table, his face flushed with a dark, dangerous red hue. He clenched his fists and marched toward me, taking heavy strides across the oak floorboards. "You arrogant little paper pusher," he spat, raising his right arm as if he intended to grab my shoulder. "You think you can march into my life and take my things away from me?" He never made it within 3 feet of my position. The lead marshal stepped seamlessly into the gap. The officer raised a single-gloved hand, planting it firmly against the center of Preston's chest. The impact halted my brother's momentum instantly, sending a physical shockwave through his tailored navy suit. The marshal did not draw a weapon or raise his voice. He simply stood there, an immovable object of federal authority, staring down a man who built his entire life on empty threats and bounced checks. "Take one more step toward the receiver, sir," the marshal said, his voice a low gravel warning that vibrated through the silent room. "I highly encourage you to test that boundary today." Preston's chest deflated. The physical block shattered his final illusion of dominance. He looked at the officer's dark tactical vest and then down at his own trembling hands. He was a white-collar criminal, suddenly confronted with the raw, physical reality of law enforcement. The fight drained out of him, leaving behind a pathetic, hollow shell. He stumbled backward, bumping into the edge of the walnut table and knocking over a crystal flute. The vintage champagne spilled across the wood, dripping onto the floor in a slow, sticky puddle. "Miranda, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "Please call this off. You know the division chief. You can tell them it is a misunderstanding. We can figure out a payment plan. I can liquidate the Hudson parcel. Just give me a week to secure new funding. We are family, Miranda. You cannot throw your own brother onto the street. You have to help me." I looked at the sweat dripping down his temples, soaking into his expensive collar. I remembered the harsh, bitter coffee from the shop in Brooklyn the night before. I remembered the cruel sneer on his face when he threatened to isolate me and cut me out of our parents' will. He only invoked the concept of kinship when he was trapped. When he held the power, blood meant nothing to him. "I am helping the family Preston," I replied, keeping my pitch steady and precise. "I am helping Mom and Dad." He blinked, wiping a shaking hand across his mouth, smearing a bead of sweat across his cheek. "What do you mean?" "I was the phantom municipal clerk who suspended your deed transfer in Queens," I stated, watching his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated shock. "I put the compliance block on the title. I stopped you from stripping the equity out of their home to pay off Arthur Vance. If I had given you one more week, you would have left our parents homeless just to buy yourself a few more days in this penthouse. You tried to steal their only safety net to cover your own fraudulent debt." Preston opened his mouth to deny the accusation, but the lie died on his tongue. He knew the paper trail was already in my possession. He knew I possessed the Cayman Island wire transfers bearing Victoria's signature. He slumped against the dining table, thoroughly defeated by the undeniable weight of the evidence. "You told me last night that family helps family," I said, tossing his own manipulative words right back at him. "You were right. I am protecting the innocent members of our bloodline from a predator. The predator just happens to be you. Now pack your box, Preston. You have 12 minutes left." The freight elevator hummed a low industrial note as we began our descent from the penthouse floor. The polished brass passenger cabin was strictly off limits for federal evictions. We stood inside a raw steel box that smelled intensely of heavy moving blankets and chemical floor cleaner. Preston held a small navy blue nylon duffel bag clutched tightly against his chest. Victoria carried a similar gray canvas bag. It was the physical manifestation of their remaining net worth. Just 15 minutes ago, they owned the sky. Now they possessed nothing but whatever rolled-up socks and travel-sized toiletries they could shove into a zippered compartment. The silence in the elevator was thick and suffocating. The armed United States Marshals stood like stone pillars, creating an impenetrable physical barrier between my brother and me. Victoria stared blankly at the scuffed metal floor. The pristine white crepe-sheath dress she wore looked absurdly out of place next to the dark tactical gear of the law enforcement agents. She shivered slightly despite the warm ambient temperature of the building. The heavy metal doors parted as we reached the ground floor. We stepped out into the sprawling grand lobby of the Tribeca residential fortress. The architectural design featured imported Carrara marble pillars and vaulted ceilings intended to convey absolute exclusivity. It was a space meticulously designed to separate the elite from the ordinary working class. Today it served as a sprawling amphitheater for their total social execution. News of the federal raid had already permeated the building complex. The concierge desk was completely abandoned. Instead, a large cluster of wealthy residents had gathered near the mailroom and the front glass revolving doors. These were people who managed hedge funds, directed private equity firms, and sat on elite philanthropic boards. They were the exact demographic Victoria had spent her entire adult life trying to impress and emulate. Now they stood in small, tight huddles, whispering behind manicured hands. I watched a prominent socialite pull her designer poodle closer as Victoria walked past her. The physical recoiling of the neighbor was unmistakable. The woman looked at my sister-in-law as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. Victoria's rigid posture crumbled instantly. The arrogant matriarch who had commanded catering staff with an iron fist an hour ago shrank into a hollow, trembling figure. She raised a shaking hand to shield her face from the humiliating stares, but there was absolutely nowhere to hide. The marble walls offered no sanctuary. The sheer weight of the public disgrace acted as a chemical catalyst. The psychological pressure cooker finally burst right in the middle of the opulent atrium. Victoria stopped walking, her heels skidding slightly on the polished stone. She dropped her gray canvas bag onto the pristine floor. The heavy thud echoed sharply through the silent lobby. She spun around to face Preston, her features twisted into a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated venom. "You ruined my life," she shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered hysteria. "You told me this firm was a sure thing. You promised me security and status. Now I am being paraded through my own lobby like a common criminal because you were too blind to manage your corporate leverage. My reputation is destroyed, Preston. I will never be able to show my face in Manhattan society again. You greedy, pathetic failure." Preston halted, his jaw dropping in genuine disbelief. He looked at the whispering neighbors capturing the scene on their smartphones and then back at the woman he married. The final frayed thread of their toxic alliance snapped. He did not defend his honor or attempt to soothe her spiraling panic. He went straight for the jugular. "My greed," he bellowed, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. "Do not stand here and play the innocent victim, Victoria. You knew exactly where the mezzanine money was going. You spent the stolen capital on diamond collars and platinum watches, while I tried to keep the lenders at bay." He turned his body, physically pivoting toward the lead Securities and Exchange Commission agent walking directly beside me. He pointed a shaking index finger straight at his wife. "She is the one who set up the offshore shell entities," he shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "She authorized the outgoing transfers to the Cayman Islands. I did not sign those international wire documents. She did. Check the banking signatures. She is the sole architect of the capital flight." Victoria let out a choked, agonizing gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth. She realized her husband had just served her up to federal prosecutors to save his own skin. I stood perfectly still, watching the mutual destruction unfold with quiet dignity. I did not need a stark interrogation room. I did not need to offer lenient plea deals or conduct grueling cross-examinations. The intense pressure of losing their luxury lifestyle stripped away their marital loyalty in less than 5 minutes. They were handing me full criminal confessions right in the middle of a crowded residential lobby. White-collar criminals always turn on each other when the money disappears. The SEC agent raised a skeptical eyebrow, pulling a small digital recorder from his tactical vest. I reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved the heavy blue evidentiary binder I had prepared at Foley Square. I held the folder out, extending it toward the lead agent. "You will find the confirmed international wire transfer logs in Section 4, I stated, keeping my tone level and strictly professional. The documents include the verified signature blocks for Victoria Bush authorizing 40 individual offshore transactions. The designated holding company matches her boutique accounting firm in this exact neighborhood. The paper trail is fully documented and legally sound." The agent accepted the binder, offering a grim nod of acknowledgement. Victoria sank to her knees on the marble floor, sobbing uncontrollably as the officers read the formal Miranda warning. My secure phone vibrated violently against my hip. I slid the device from my pocket and glanced at the glowing screen. The tactical operation was moving into Phase 2, but a different notification caught my attention. It was the extended family group chat, the same digital forum Victoria had weaponized to isolate me just 24 hours prior. For the past day, the chat had been a continuous stream of patronizing concern regarding my supposed mental breakdown. Aunt Susan and my cousins had relentlessly diagnosed my jealousy and praised Preston's visionary success. That fake narrative was currently disintegrating in real time. A cousin posted a breaking news link from a major financial publication. The headline read, "Federal Strike Team Raids Vanguard Heights in Securities Fraud Probe. CEO Preston Bush evicted from Tribeca Penthouse." Below the news link, a barrage of chaotic messages flooded the screen. Aunt Susan typed a string of frantic question marks. Another relative asked if the financial article was a malicious prank. The carefully constructed smear campaign collapsed into digital ash. They were reading the cold, hard reality of the situation, broadcast to the entire world. I was not the toxic pariah suffering from bitter envy. I was the federal agent who dismantled the fraud. The family members who had eagerly participated in my social assassination were now staring at the humiliating wreckage of their own gullibility. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. The whispering neighbors in the lobby continued taking photos, capturing the final pathetic moments of the Vanguard Heights empire. Preston and Victoria were guided through the revolving glass doors and out onto the wet Manhattan pavement, where black tactical vehicles waited by the curb. Their reign of arrogant classism was officially over. I took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, preparing for the most important task remaining on my schedule. I needed to drive across the bridge to Queens to show my parents the phantom deed block that saved their future. I left the Tactical Command Center operating out of the Tribeca lobby shortly after the transport vehicles departed. The armed federal agents were still securing the perimeter of the cobblestone street as I walked toward my own vehicle. The drive across the East River felt like traveling between two entirely different dimensions. Manhattan operates as a vertical monument to ambition and unyielding greed. Queens exists as a horizontal grid of survival, quiet endurance, and modest stability. I navigated the familiar traffic patterns on the Long Island Expressway, gripping the steering wheel. The pure adrenaline that sustained my focus during the penthouse raid began to metabolize, leaving a deep, profound ache in my muscles. The hardest part of the operation was not arresting white-collar criminals. The hardest part was about to unfold inside a small brick house on a quiet residential street. I parked my sensible sedan in the narrow driveway. The front lawn was perfectly manicured. The aging aluminum siding caught the late morning light. As I walked up the concrete steps, I could hear the television broadcasting at an unusually high volume through the front bay window. I unlocked the front door using the brass key I had carried on my keyring since high school. The local news affiliate was running a live helicopter shot of my brother's luxury building. A bold red graphic crawled across the bottom of the flat-screen monitor. Vanguard Heights executive detained in multi-agency securities fraud sweep. My mother stood in the center of the living room, clutching a checkered dishcloth to her chest. Her face was entirely drained of color, displaying a sickly, translucent pallor. My father sat on the edge of his worn recliner, staring at the television as if it were transmitting a signal from another planet. They did not notice me entering the hallway. "This is a terrible mistake," my mother whispered, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "They have the wrong company. Preston is a legitimate developer. Why are there law enforcement vehicles outside his building?" I placed my leather briefcase on the floor and stepped onto the living room carpet. "It is not a mistake, Mom," I stated, keeping my tone incredibly soft. My father turned his head slowly. The profound confusion in his eyes was heartbreaking. He looked at my conservative gray suit and the federal identification badge still hanging around my neck. The visual collision of his daughter wearing a government uniform while his son was being hauled away in handcuffs short-circuited his understanding of our entire family dynamic. "Miranda, what is happening?" he asked, his voice barely rising above a coarse rasp. "The reporter is talking about embezzlement. They are saying Preston stole investor capital. Let us go into the kitchen, Dad," I suggested, gently guiding my mother by her shoulder. "Sit down at the table. I will explain everything." We gathered around the familiar scratched wooden table. It was the exact surface where Preston had confidently pitched his exclusive investment opportunity just a few days prior. My mother refused to let go of the dishcloth, twisting the fabric into a tight, tense knot. I sat across from them, folding my hands together, resting them on the wood. I did not speak with the sharp, clinical cadence I utilized during the penthouse eviction. I spoke to them as their daughter. Vanguard Heights was never a successful real estate firm. I began choosing my words with careful precision. Preston was drowning in toxic debt. He borrowed millions of dollars from unregulated shadow lenders to fund a lavish lifestyle he could not actually afford. When the debt came due, he started siphoning capital from new investors to pay off the old ones. The Southern District has been tracking the financial anomalies for months. But the leased cars, my mother protested, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. The expensive dinners. "He was doing so well, Miranda. He was building a legacy for our family. He was building a mirage, Mom. He rented the luxury vehicles. He leveraged the dinners on corporate credit. None of it belonged to him. He was a desperate man trapped in his own lies." I reached down into my leather briefcase and retrieved a single piece of paper. It was a printed copy of the municipal filing I had intercepted on Wednesday morning. I slid the document across the scratched table, stopping it directly in front of my father. When a fraudster runs out of stranger capital to steal, they always turn toward the people closest to them, I explained. "Do you remember the estate planning documents Preston asked you to sign a few nights ago?" My father picked up the paper. He retrieved his reading glasses from his shirt pocket and slid them onto his nose. He scanned the legal jargon, his brow furrowing deeper with every line he read. "This says quitclaim deed," he muttered, sounding out the legal terminology. "It transfers the title of this house to an entity called Cobalt Apex Holdings. I do not understand. Preston said he was putting the house into a protective family trust to avoid probate court." Cobalt Apex Holdings is a Delaware shell company entirely controlled by Victoria I, stated, maintaining direct eye contact. "They were not protecting your estate, Dad. They were stealing your equity. Preston owed an immense penalty to a ruthless private lender today. He was going to hand over the title of your home to satisfy his corporate debt. If this paperwork had been processed by the county clerk, you would have received a municipal eviction notice by the end of the month." The remaining color drained from my father's face, leaving a hollow, ashen tone. His hands began to shake violently, rattling the printed document. He looked around the modest kitchen, taking in the faded wallpaper, the aging appliances, and the small comforts they had spent 30 years earning. The reality of their near destruction crashed down upon him. He dropped the paper onto the table as if it had burned his fingertips. My mother let out a sharp, agonizing sob. She covered her face with both hands, the checkered dishcloth falling to the linoleum floor. The golden child illusion shattered into a million irreparable fragments. The son she idolized, the visionary developer in the bespoke suits, had plotted to throw her onto the street to save his own fraudulent pride. The magnitude of the betrayal was physically sickening. "The deed transfer never went through," I said, reaching across the table to grasp my father's trembling hand. "I placed a federal compliance block on the title filing on Wednesday morning. The county clerk rejected the paperwork. Your home is fully safe. The title is still locked firmly in your names. Nobody can touch your property." My father squeezed my hand, his grip tight and desperate. Tears welled in his aged eyes, spilling over the deep wrinkles etched into his cheeks. "We almost gave him everything," he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of immense shame. "We thought he was a financial genius. We thought you were just playing it safe in a stagnant job. We let his expensive clothes and his smooth talking blind us to who he really was." My mother reached out, grasping my other hand. "I am so sorry, Miranda," she cried, her shoulders shaking with every breath. "Victoria told everyone you were jealous. She called our relatives and said you were having a mental breakdown. And we listened to her. We doubted our own daughter because she wore diamonds and you wore a civil servant uniform. I am so incredibly sorry." I sat there holding their hands, letting them release the fear and the suffocating guilt. I did not gloat. There was no vindictive satisfaction in seeing my parents cry. There was no desire to utter the phrase, "I told you so." The toxic social hierarchy that had tormented me for years was dead and buried. I only felt a quiet, profound relief. "You do not need to apologize," I told them, squeezing their hands back. "You are safe. That is all that matters." They had spent years viewing my career as a dead-end failure. They assumed my modest federal salary was a symptom of low ambition. They did not realize that the very institution they mocked was the only shield standing between them and total financial ruin. My tedious, bureaucratic paperwork had just saved our entire lineage from a devastating bankruptcy. The flashy tailored suits and the platinum watches were currently sitting in the back of a federal transport vehicle heading toward a holding cell. The sensible gray blazer was sitting at the kitchen table, keeping the unshakable foundation of our family intact. 3 months passed since the tactical raid in Tribeca. The suffocating heat of the New York summer surrendered to a sharp, biting autumn chill. The leaves in Central Park turned brittle, scraping across the wet pavement under the gray November sky. The world moved forward, maintaining its relentless pace regardless of the shattered empires left behind in the dirt. My brother and my sister-in-law did not survive the immense pressure of the federal justice system. When the Department of Justice unsealed the comprehensive 48-count indictment detailing wire fraud and corporate conspiracy, their toxic marital loyalty dissolved into open warfare. During the preliminary hearings, Preston attempted to trade his wife to the federal prosecutors, offering her up in exchange for a reduced prison sentence. He testified that she orchestrated the offshore shell companies without his explicit consent. Victoria retaliated immediately. She filed motions claiming extreme coercion, portraying herself as a terrified victim held hostage by a manipulative tyrant. The presiding judge reviewed the digital evidence and denied both their motions. They are currently awaiting a joint trial facing mandatory minimum sentences that will consume the best years of their lives. The opulent lifestyle Victoria worshipped is nothing but a ghost. The court authorized the liquidation of every single asset purchased with commingled funds. The federal government auctioned her sapphire gowns, her diamond collars, and her designer handbags to reimburse the defrauded mezzanine investors. She no longer hosts lavish champagne breakfasts overlooking the Hudson River. She resides in a damp concrete basement bedroom inside her parents' house in suburban New Jersey. The ambient noise of a live harpist has been replaced by the rhythmic clanking of an aging water heater. Her days of mocking civil servants ended the exact moment she sat in a sterile room and applied for a public defender because she could no longer afford private counsel. Preston secured a release on bond, but the terms are incredibly severe. He wears a bulky GPS monitoring device strapped tightly around his ankle, dictating his every movement. He sleeps on a cheap mattress in a rented room located in a borough he used to casually mock during elite networking events. The wealthy socialites and powerful developers who once drank his vintage Bordeaux do not answer his phone calls anymore. He is a total pariah in the only society he ever valued. The tailored suits hang loosely on his shrinking frame, a physical manifestation of his deteriorating ego. The social hierarchy within our bloodline experienced a severe, irreversible correction. The extended relatives who eagerly participated in my character assassination 3 months ago suddenly developed a miraculous sense of clarity. The aunts and cousins who flooded my phone with patronizing advice about my supposed mental breakdown now flood my inbox with desperate, groveling apologies. Aunt Susan sent a large, elaborate fruit basket to my apartment lobby, accompanied by a handwritten note begging for an opportunity to explain her side of the story. She wrote paragraphs claiming she always suspected Preston was running a fraudulent business, and she only sided with him out of fear. I left the basket on the concierge desk for the building staff to enjoy. I receive a steady stream of long, rambling voicemails from cousins who once viewed me as the family failure. They tell me how proud they are of my crucial government work. They invite me to holiday gatherings they previously excluded me from attending. I delete the messages before they finish playing. I do not return their phone calls, and I do not owe them my forgiveness. I do not require their fake respect, because their respect is conditional upon my perceived power. I simply enforce a permanent boundary of total silence, leaving them to suffocate in the awkward shame of their own gullibility. My parents remain safe and secure inside their modest brick home in Queens. The voided municipal deed transfer sits locked inside a metal safe deposit box, serving as a permanent silent reminder of the lethal bullet they narrowly dodged. They no longer equate leased luxury vehicles with supreme intelligence. They no longer view my career as a temporary stepping stone to a better life. They treat my profession with a quiet, profound reverence. We share dinner together every Sunday evening, sitting around the scratched wooden table. Nobody mentions bridge loans or generational wealth. They just appreciate the simple, unshakable stability of owning the roof over their heads. I arrived at the Foley Square Federal Building at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. The 12th floor smelled of the familiar floor wax and recycled paper. I walked into my office, locked the heavy oak door, and hung my coat on the brass hook. My conservative gray suit felt like a suit of armor. My practical heels clicked against the linoleum floor, anchoring me to the physical reality of the space. I sat down at my heavy steel desk and booted up my dual monitors, listening to the low, steady hum of the building ventilation system. I looked out the narrow window, watching the towering glass skyscrapers of Manhattan catch the early morning sunlight. The city operates on a collective, blinding delusion. People routinely destroy their own lives chasing the hollow appearance of success. They leverage their futures, borrowing money they do not have, to buy designer labels and exclusive zip codes they cannot afford. They believe a $40,000 platinum watch makes them invincible. They believe a $12 million penthouse elevates them above the basic rules of human decency and the consequences of their own actions. I spent years enduring their condescending laughter. I sat quietly at crowded family dinners while superficial people measured my worth against their fraudulent bank balances. I listened to them call me a dead-end paper pusher because I did not crave the spotlight. But true authority does not seek an audience. True power does not require a crystal flute or a charity gala to validate its existence. I do not need a diamond collar to prove I hold value in this world. My validation comes from the quiet, unwavering authority of the law and the undeniable knowledge that I hold the line against the corrupt. A junior clerk knocked twice on my door and walked into the office. He carried a new referral from the Securities and Exchange Commission. He placed the heavy manila folder directly in the center of my steel desk. The file was sealed with bright red tamper-evident tape, indicating a high-priority federal target. A new, highly leveraged entity hiding behind slick marketing brochures and fake equity was about to face the crushing weight of the justice system. The cycle of greed and consequence never stops turning in this city. There will always be another arrogant developer trying to cheat the math. I looked at the red tape. I felt the familiar clinical focus sharpen my mind, clearing away all distractions. I reached across the desk and picked up my standard issue black pen. The plastic barrel felt solid and familiar between my fingers. I pressed the metal tip against the thick paper, breaking the seal with a sharp, decisive tear. I am the silent, unshakable guardian of the federal courts, and I am ready to dismantle the next illusion. When you stand at a distance and observe the glittering, jagged skyline of Manhattan, it is easy to mistake the towering structures of glass and steel for monuments of human triumph. But if you view the world through the quiet, unyielding lens of a spiritual practitioner, someone who has learned to separate the eternal from the ephemeral, you see something entirely different. You see a sprawling, magnificent temple built to worship the ego. The story of Preston and Victoria's $12 million collapse is not merely a tale of white-collar crime or financial ruin. It is a profound spiritual tragedy, a stark reflection of the modern American family, and a desperate plea for a return to the foundational virtues of wisdom, morality, and resilience. In traditional American culture, there is an unspoken, often toxic metric applied to parenting. We are conditioned to measure the success of our child rearing by the zip codes our children inhabit, the corporate titles printed on their heavy cardstock business cards, and the luxury vehicles parked in their driveways. The parents in this narrative fell victim to this exact illusion. They sat in their modest brick home in Queens and allowed the glint of a leased Mercedes and the crisp tailoring of a designer suit to blind them to the spiritual decay rotting inside their son. They equated his financial accumulation with his moral character. They worshipped at the altar of his perceived success, enthusiastically offering up their own safety, their fully paid-off home, as a sacrifice to his vanity. This is the most critical message we can deliver to parents today. Do not let the blinding glare of materialism rewrite your definition of a good person. Raising a child to be a predator in a bespoke suit is not a parental victory. It is a profound moral failure. When parents abdicate their responsibility to demand emotional awareness, honesty, and fairness, they produce hollow vessels. Preston and Victoria were completely devoid of empathy because they were never forced to cultivate an internal compass. They operated under the delusion that wealth was a substitute for a soul measuring love in square footage and loyalty in offshore wire transfers. As parents, the ultimate duty is not to push children toward the highest tax bracket, but to guide them toward self-correction. We must teach them to look inward, to prune their own egos, and to develop the wisdom to recognize that any life built on the exploitation of others is a house built on sand. From the perspective of the spiritual path, a meaningful life rests on three unshakable pillars: wisdom, morality, and resilience. The youth of today, suffocating under the weight of social media algorithms and the relentless pressure to perform wealth, can find their liberation in the character of Miranda. Her journey offers a masterful blueprint for young people navigating a deeply superficial society. Miranda possessed the wisdom to see the structural weakness in her brother's fraudulent empire. She possessed the morality to remain in a dead-end public service job because she valued the integrity of the law over the fleeting rush of stolen capital. And most importantly, she possessed the resilience to endure the agonizing isolation of being the family outcast. To the young adults reading this, understand that in a sick society, being labeled a failure is often the highest compliment your soul can receive. When the crowd mocks your modest salary, your practical shoes, and your quiet life, do not shrink. Do not attempt to explain your peace to people who are addicted to chaos. Miranda did not scream. She did not defend her reputation against her sister-in-law's vicious smear campaign, and she did not compromise her ethics to buy her brother's approval. She simply drank her black coffee and held the line. She cultivated the internal fortitude to let the illusions around her burn to the ground, knowing that the truth does not need a defense attorney. It only needs time. This narrative forces us to confront a deeply contrarian viewpoint regarding the traditional family structure. We are conditioned from birth to believe that blood is an unbreakable covenant, that family helps family no matter the cost, and that biological loyalty must supersede our personal boundaries. We are taught that maintaining the peace at the Thanksgiving table is the ultimate virtue. But this story demands that we look at the dark underbelly of unconditional loyalty. Sometimes the concept of family is weaponized by predators to extract your resources, your peace, and your sanity. The contrarian truth is this: unconditional support for a toxic family member is not an act of love. It is an act of spiritual enabling. True familial responsibility does not mean co-signing a fraudulent bridge loan or mortgaging your retirement to feed a brother's endless greed. True responsibility sometimes looks like cold, calculated destruction. Sometimes the highest, purest form of love you can offer a corrupt bloodline is to open the heavy oak doors and let the federal marshals walk inside. By stripping her brother of his stolen wealth and his false dignity, Miranda did not destroy her family. She stopped the infection. She preserved the foundation. She executed a brutal, necessary surgery so that the innocent members of her lineage could survive. If this reflection resonates with the quiet battles you are fighting in your own life, if you have ever been the scapegoat in a family that worshiped the wrong idol, you are not alone. There is a community of people learning to set unyielding boundaries and find power in their silence. I invite you to drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to Morning Revenge for more stories about ordinary people delivering extraordinary quiet justice. As the dust settles on the shattered $12 million penthouse, we are left to look at the wreckage and ask ourselves a terrifying question. We spend our entire lives terrified of losing our possessions, our status, and the approval of the people who share our last name. We exhaust our spirits trying to keep the fractured glass of our family dynamics perfectly intact. But look closely at the empty hands of those who chase the illusion, and look at the serene, unshakable peace of the woman who walked away with nothing but her integrity. Perhaps the ultimate tragedy of the human experience is not that we might lose everything we have spent our lives building. Perhaps the true tragedy is waking up one day to realize that the only way to save your soul was to let the entire beautiful, fraudulent structure collapse on top of you.